I started out in Montreal, and in 1961, I came to Oxford University, to New College in particular, to do the B.Phil in philosophy. And soon after having arrived, I was given what was called a moral tutor. Not because I was thought very immoral, or not even because I was thought at all immoral, but because everyone had a moral tutor then. Now they don't exist. Now there are only college advisors. Either because now students are so moral that they don't need moral tutors, or because they're so immoral that there's no point even in trying to make them moral. Now, my moral tutor was called Tony Quinton. He's still alive, but he's no longer merely Tony Quinton. Now he is Lord Quinton, the Baron Quinton. In Britain, they have these amazing changes of personal identity, where somebody can all his or her life, well, in this case his, be Tony Quinton, and then one day suddenly, poof, it's Lord Quinton. We didn't have that in Montreal. It's true that we had some earls in Montreal. There was Earl Shapiro, he was in my class. There was Earl Bernstein. There was even Earl McCormick. But they were always earls. I mean, they started out as earls, and they stayed earls, and they died as earls. There wasn't any of this kind of magic metaphysics that seemed to apply in Oxford. In any case, at the time when he was my moral tutor, Tony Quinton was simply Tony Quinton. And a strange thing happened, and this is absolutely true. At a certain point in the story that I'm going to tell you, I'm going to raise my arm like this. That's the point at which I transform reality into fantasy for the sake of, well, I hope, for the sake of what I hope will be a response of laughter on your part. Not yet. No, not yet. Right? So the made-up part will occur at this point. In any case, I had been in Oxford, I think about 10 days into my first term there, and nothing was happening. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. It's absolutely true. I didn't receive any piece of paper that told me that I had to go to these classes or those classes. So I went to see, well, I happened to bump into Tony Quinton in the quadrangle, and I questioned Quinton in the quad. I said, what am I supposed to do? You know, I'm supposed to be studying here for a degree, but nobody's told me what to do. And he said, and I quote, I should have thought you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle. He said, I should have thought you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle. I was very mystified by this sentence. I'd never heard anybody use so many auxiliary verbs in one sentence like that, right? I mean, I should have thought that you would have got in touch with Gilbert Ryle. And it seemed to me that he was saying that at least one of us had done something bad, right? If not both. So, to expiate my sin, or his sin, or both of our sins, I rang up Gilbert Ryle. And there were a couple of rings, and then what I heard was the following. And I know there are some people here who know from their own experience that this is what I heard. So I rang up. Ryle! That's all. Ryle! Now, I assumed he was naming himself, since my name was not Ryle, but Cohen. But that didn't completely solve the problem of what I was supposed to say. I mean, I somehow didn't feel that I should respond by saying, Cohen! So I said, sir, my name is Jerry Cohen, and I was wondering if I could come and see you. And he said, yes, indeed. So I said, when should I come and see you? And he said, pretty well anywhen. He did say that. He said, pretty well, my hand hasn't gone up yet. He said, pretty well anywhen. What about Thursday, crack of dawn? That's 10 o'clock. So I showed up, and he was in person more forceful, more booming, louder, and not intimidating. I mean, you know, you go to the circus and you see a clown shouting, you don't get intimidated. And there was this marvelous way of talking, you know, which was so mannered, and people hypothesized that it was a consequence of the fact that during the Second World War he had been a major and he had picked up this mode of speech during that experience. But I think it was so deep he must have had it as a kid, you know, as a baby even. You know, I can't really imagine him whining as a baby. I mean, I can imagine him saying, "Milk!" You know, burp! Anyway, we had a lot of arguments, and he was a marvelously generous teacher. And on one occasion, he said, and notice my arm hasn't gone up yet, he said, we were talking about sensations, about pleasure and pain. And he said the following, he said, "Unlike pain, pleasure lacks a distinct bodily location." So I said, but sir, what about sexual pleasure? And he said, "There is that, but I was thinking of something more interesting." "There's a difference between agony and torture, but I'm not quite sure what it is. Do you have any thoughts about that?" So I said, let's see, I can agonize somebody, and I can torture somebody. See, I was kind of imitating his way of doing philosophy, where you say things that you can say and that you can't say, and that's it, right? I can agonize someone, and no, I didn't speak like that. I've got the wrong one. I said, I can agonize someone, and I can torture someone, and I can both be in agony. I can be in agony, but I can't be in torture. And then he said, and this is when he said, well, this isn't really what he said, but this is of the type of form or sort or kind of thing that he would say. He said, "Yes, torture and agony are the same kind of thing, but they're not the same type of thing. Because kinds and types, although the same sort of thing, don't belong to the same category. Since categories and classes, while alike in order, differ in nature, because orders and natures, though similar in character, belong to different dimensions." Now, we now, ladies and gentlemen, we now come to a practical decision that we have to make together, because I hope you don't find it boastful if I say what is true, that I think I have pretty well enough material to continue in this fashion for 4 lectures. And I think most people would actually enjoy this more than what I'm scheduled to give you. And you know, enjoyment, after all, is an important practical consideration. So the issue is whether I should continue like this or come to my proper topic. And as I've just indicated, there is a case for continuing like this, but the trouble is that if I continue like this, this would have implications for my fee. Because there is a fee for these lectures, and I'm concerned about it. And if I turn the lectures into unceasing humor of this sort, I'm afraid my fee has to be doubled. And I know that the university, Trent University is suffering difficulties of a certain kind at the moment. One might even hazard that it's suffering difficulties of a certain sort. But I don't want to add to those difficulties, so I'm going to get serious. And it's always a bit difficult to effect this kind of re-entry, but I'm just going to brazen it out. So we begin with letter A on the handout. Now, these lectures constitute the fourth installment in a polemic against the theory of justice of John Rawls, the first installment of which was lodged in the first of the 3 articles by me that are listed in footnote 1 on the handout. And the thesis of the lectures, which were published as indicated, was that a certain principle which John Rawls is famous for, namely the difference principle — I'll abort that sentence and start a new one. John Rawls is famous for having enunciated the principle, a principle called the difference principle, which says that inequalities are justified only if they are necessary to raise the condition of the worst off people in society. Now, what I argued in the lectures in question is that that principle, which I did not challenge in the lectures, does not serve to justify a leading inequality that Rawls and others think it does justify. And what inequality is that? It is the inequality consequent on the provision of handsome monetary incentives to productive people. According to the Rawlsian story, if everybody gets the same wage, then some people who would put in much more effort if they got higher wages than others won't produce as much as they could. And so it's beneficial to offer them much more money than others. Then they'll produce more, and that extra production, which the productive people supply, can be used to the benefit under appropriate government taxation and other policies. It can be used to the benefit of less productive people. That's a very familiar argument. It's an argument that contemporary politicians give against raising taxes. Left-wing people say, let's raise taxes on the rich and redistribute the money to the poor. Right-wing people say, that's foolish. If you do that, you'll get less tax take because you'll get less productivity on the part of the productive people who are attracted by high rewards. Now, in the lectures, in those Tanner lectures, I questioned neither the difference principle itself, the principle that is that inequality is justified when it redounds to the benefit of the worst off people, nor that causal story about the consequences of wage or salary inequality. That's not to say that I endorsed the principle or that I endorsed the causal story, but I mounted a critique of this argument which did not involve a rejection either of the principle or of that causal story. My claim was that even if we accept the difference principle, whether or not we accept the difference principle, this is B, the principle does not justify the said inequality as a feature of a just society because of a truth about the character of a just society that Rawls himself affirms. Namely, that a just society is a society whose citizens believe in and live by the principles that make the society just. So there's a certain view one might take of what a just society is, namely that whatever else it is, it's one whose people are just and behave justly. And it seemed to me that this argument violates that constraint for the following reasons. My argument begins, that is my argument against the argument that I've described, begins with the observation that these unequalizing incentives are required to promote the interests of badly off people only if and because productive people are unwilling, in the absence of the said incentives, to perform so productively as they will when unequalizing incentives obtain. The argument attributes a certain attitude to the productive people. and works only insofar as the productive people display and act on that attitude. Now, I claim that that unwillingness, the unwillingness to produce as much as you otherwise would when tax goes up, even though you're still going to be far better off than the worst off people in society, the unwillingness to produce as much as you did before, if you're a talented and highly paid person, if tax goes up, simply because, for purely self-regarding reasons, that you'd rather work 10 hours less or something like that, and not because it's going to make your life more burdensome than the lives of those who are burdened at the bottom of society. I claim that that unwillingness implies, as I say in the handout, lack of full commitment on the part of productive people themselves to the difference principle. That is, if they believe the difference principle, that the only thing that could justify an inequality is that it redounds to the benefit of the badly off people, then they wouldn't be striking the posture that the argument attributes to them. After all, the difference principle justifies only those inequalities that are necessary to raise the condition of the badly off. But, as I've already observed, the inequalities that incentive payments induce are not necessary all simply or tout court. That is, they are not necessary no matter what anybody wills, but they're necessary only because of the unwillingness of productive people to produce prolifically without them. So, if the difference principle justifies these economic incentives, it justifies them only because the productive people are uninfluenced by the difference principle in their own economic behavior. That is, only because the productive people don't give a damn about the situation of badly off people when they use their prodigious bargaining power to extract from the market as much as they can. And therefore, the difference principle justifies unequalizing incentives only if the productive people are regarded as outside the community for which policy is being made, as though they are a natural force or foreigners that whose policies and attitudes we simply have to come to terms with, but are not actually part of the society which is governed by the difference principle. So in effect, though not in intention, this Rawlsian story represents productive people as an exogenous party whose behavior is not itself guided by the principles of justice. And that contradicts the aforementioned requirement, namely Rawls's own plausible requirement on a just society that its citizens live by the principles that make it just. How can these people, as they're supposed to do, vote for tax policies with the interests of the badly off people in mind, and then, once that structure is erected, try to get as much as they can from the productive system, thereby making things worse than they need to be for those whom they purport to wish to benefit when they subscribe as just citizens to this economic law. Now, that is elaborated at length in those lectures. And I developed the case further in the other two articles that are mentioned on the handout with answers to various objections. Further objections have since been published, and some of the people who have made those objections, I've listed their articles in that footnote. Estlund, Podgy, and Williams have objected to this argument. And other objections are in the pipeline to publication. So see, the issue has ramified, and lots of considerations and arguments have been generated that I didn't anticipate when I first made the critique that I've reported of the incentive argument. And what I'm going to seek to do in the present lectures is to address a fundamental methodological disagreement, about what justice is, not about the content of justice, but about the general form of justice and of how to determine what's just and what isn't just, because I've come to see that there is a fundamental methodological disagreement that I have with Rawlsians, and that methodological disagreement is an important part of the background to the substantive disagreement about incentives that I've tried to describe. So to explain what this methodological disagreement is, let me say a little more about the substantive disagreement about economic justice that I now believe is partly due to the methodological disagreement. So there are two disagreements here. There's a disagreement about whether unequalizing incentives are just. That's a substantive disagreement. And there's a further disagreement, as yet not described by me, but I will in a moment, about how you're supposed to determine what the correct principles of justice are. Now, in the essay called Where the Action Is, I addressed, and I believe I refuted, an objection to the critique of Rawls's application of the difference principle, which I described a few moments ago, and which I call the basic structure objection. This is D. That's not the basic structure objection. Neither is that. Come on. Well, anyway. According to the said objection, and I've written this down in D, what I do in the thing that I described at the outset is to extend the writ or authority of the difference principle from a principle that's supposed to govern government policy to the daily behavior and choices of economic citizens. And according to the basic structure objection to my procedure, my extension of the writ of the difference principle to the choices of productive producers in everyday life is inappropriate because their behavior occurs within and doesn't determine what's called the basic structure of society, and it is only to the basic structure of society that principles of justice apply. So the Rawlsian view is that justice is a matter of the ground rules of the economic game and of social interaction. Once those ground rules are in place, you can do what you like without prejudice either to the justice of the society or to your standing as a just person. You're just, provided that you respect the ground rules and don't try to cheat on them. Now, in reply to the basic structure objection, this is E, I investigate the reason Rawls gives for treating the basic structure as what he calls the primary subject of justice. He says in his book, A Theory of Justice, that the reason why justice is a matter of the basic structure, and of the basic structure alone, is that, as he puts it, its effects are so profound and present from the start. This is the thing that has a massive influence on everybody's life chances, the way the society is organized as a matter of the fundamental coercive rules that the state imposes. But it seems to me that this is evidently insufficient reason for regarding justice as applying to the basic structure only, because the effect of the behavior of economic agents on people's life chances is comparably profound. And the exclusion of that behavior from the scope of the difference principle, this is on the handout in E, is therefore entirely arbitrary and inconsistent with the grounds Rawls gives for focus on the basic structure. I mean, when people in certain societies, when people of higher market power contented themselves with wages which were not vastly out of order with what people with less bargaining clout got, the people with less bargaining clout were better off than they came to be when Thatcherite or Reaganite consciousness began to prevail, and the pigs wanted more in their troughs and were in a position to ensure that they got it. There needn't be any change in economic regulation to induce that result. There only needs to be a change in economic consciousness. Now, I'm not saying there was no change in economic regulation, but I'm saying quite apart from that, when motivations change, this will have substantial material effects on badly off people. So F. Accordingly then, if I'm right in my critique of Rawls on incentives, the just society, the society that upholds and implements the difference principle, requires not only justice at the level of the rules enforced by the state, but also an egalitarian ethos of justice that informs individual choice. In the absence of such an ethos, don't worry, I'm not having a stroke or anything. It's just that I was thinking of something else. In the absence of such, I mean, I'm not guaranteeing that I won't have a stroke, but it hasn't happened yet. Okay, in the absence of such an ethos, inequalities will obtain that are not necessary to enhance the condition of the worst off. And the required ethos will promote a distribution more just than what the rules of the economic game by themselves can secure. Now here comes a point which is crucial to the disagreement that I have with the Rawlsians, which is this. Whether or not an individual is conforming to the required egalitarian ethos is, for more than one reason, very difficult to determine. For one thing, justice does not demand that an individual forego an incentive to perform a certain function, where performing that function is so repugnant to him or her that doing so without extra compensation would degrade her life to a point where it is no better than that led by badly off people. I mean, you have two people, each of whom would rather be a gardener than a doctor. And each of whom is, let us say, as a gardener, at the pay they now get, far better off from any point of view, whether it be money or job satisfaction, than most people in society. But we don't need gardeners, we need doctors. So we offer these two people more money in order to become doctors instead of gardeners. Now it happens that one of them actually hates doctoring and the other loves it. Each prefers gardening to doctoring. But one of them hates doctoring, the other loves it. But they both exercise their market power to the maximum to get, let's say, I don't know, $100,000 more a year as a doctor than a gardener. One of them, from an egalitarian point of view, is perfectly justified in what she's doing, because actually without that 100,000, she's going to be pretty miserable. It's needed to compensate for the fact that she hates doctoring. The other one doesn't hate doctoring, just disprefers doctoring compared to gardening. And so she is behaving in a counter-egalitarian way when making that requirement. Now, you can't go into people's minds and hearts and feelings to determine who's ripping people off and who it. Well, ripping off is perhaps a prejudicial way of putting it, but you can't go into the structure of people's consciousness and response to see who's being counter-egalitarian and who isn't. So therefore, whether or not an individual is conforming to an egalitarian ethos is extremely difficult to tell. You can't tell whether performing a certain function is so repugnant to somebody that it would degrade his or her life to do it without compensation. And it'll often be impossible even for the intimates of that person to tell whether or not her performance of a certain function is unusually repugnant. It will often indeed even be difficult for the person herself to tell whether it is. Because in order to reckon that, you need to compare your own level of job fulfillment to that of others at large, and that raises severe epistemic difficulties, severe difficulties about how you're going to figure out such a thing. And so, as I say in G, the principles of an egalitarian ethos cannot be crisply stated. And whether or not someone respects them can, for that and other reasons, be difficult to determine, although very importantly, and this is a point to which I'll return in the fourth lecture, it can be much less difficult for her and for others to determine whether or not she is making a good faith effort to conform to an egalitarian ethos. H. These features of the ethos, the difficulty of stating it precisely, and the associated, though not entirely consequent, difficulty of discerning whether or not someone is conforming to the egalitarian ethos are the point of departure for a critique of my position by a young man called Andrew Williams. Williams insists that in Rawlsian justice and in truth, a principle of publicity about justice prevails. This is a very important principle for many people. It's a principle which says that it must be transparent what the rules of justice are and whether or not someone is conforming to them. This must be something that we should be able to tell. And the reason is that individuals are entitled to refuse the sacrifices that are demanded by justice or that otherwise might be demanded by justice if they lack assurance that other people are sacrificing as well. It's not fair for me to undertake some self-sacrifice in the interest of justice unless I know that other people at large are doing so. And how can I have that assurance with respect to conformity to an egalitarian ethos, which cannot be made precise, and moreover, even if it could be made precise, the springs of people's behavior are not fully accessible, so I couldn't tell who's conforming to it and who isn't. So if it's right that the principles of justice have to have this public character, then my critique of Rawls collapses. Because remember, I say, well, there are these principles which you're applying to the state but not to the behavior of individuals. There's no good reason for that. The behavior of individuals has an enormous impact on the fates of people and therefore on the fates of badly off people. I have to concede that the modeling of that principle for the case of individuals cannot be as clear-cut as it is in the case of the legislation by the state. But if justice has to have this public character, then my extension of the difference principle to the ordinary behavior of people will fail. If Williams is right, my critique of Rawls goes out, and there's no inconsistency in Rawls's failure to apply the difference principle to people's job and income choices because a publicity constraint on justice forbids that application. Now, I, that is letter I, it may indeed be desirable that the rules governing behavior in a society possess the stated publicity property. And it is true that the rules of the ethos that I advocate in significant measure, not entirely, but in some measure, lack that publicity property. But I believe that publicity is at most a desideratum of the rules regulating society and not a proper constraint on the content of justice. I believe that in certain instances, such as the present one, representing publicity as a constraint on justice conflicts with deep intuitions about justice itself, and that those intuitions must prevail when we are seeking to formulate what justice is. I believe, in short, that the attempt to say what justice is cannot be identified with the attempt to lay down the ground rules that we're all going to live by for social interaction. For example, World War II in Britain, when it was imperative for everybody in the society to resist the Nazi challenge. And there was a principle of justice that prevailed, namely that everybody has to do their bit, an incredibly important principle. You know, and people would say, I've done my bit, or he's not really doing his bit, or I'm not sure whether she's doing her bit, and so forth. Now, it would be insane to think that you could lay down as a matter of precise rule what constitutes doing your bit in such a collective effort. It would be insane to think that you could tell with any precision whether or not somebody was making an appropriate contribution, because people's life situations are various. And if somebody is only doing 3 hours a week of I forget what it's called when you stand on the top of buildings and and look to see if there are any airplanes, early warning, things like that, rather than somebody else is doing 6. That may be because their child is sickly or something like that, and they need to spend more time at home, or that may be because they have a bad back and it's a bigger drag for them to do it, right? It's just too contingent and various what features of people's situations will be good reasons for them to give more or less of their efforts in such a collective effort than other people. But that doesn't mean that it's not a principle of fairness that everybody does their bit. So I think that it's very important to see then that this publicity constraint is not a constraint on justice, but of course it can be a constraint on the fundamental rules that are coercively applied in society. Or consider the case of racism, which is an injustice on virtually any view of what justice is. Despite that, there can be indiscernible racism. There can be racism of which the perpetrator herself is unaware. There can be racism in hiring, where the person herself who's doing the hiring is completely unaware that she is influenced by the color of the skin of this or that candidate. And it's impossible to lay down rules for fair treatment of candidates which are anti-racist, which go beyond a certain level of specificity. But that doesn't mean racism isn't a matter of justice. Now, I said a moment ago that publicity is at most a desideratum of the general rules regulating society and not a proper constraint on the content of justice. Well, I don't even think that it's always a desideratum of the rules regulating society. I think it would often be tyrannous if we knew exactly what equality required. Consider a camping trip. A group of friends go out on a camping trip, and they cooperate in the production and consumption of fish, berries, and so forth, under an understanding that each will contribute and benefit on egalitarian terms that resist precise statement. It's an extremely important point about camping trips, which I think has serious implications for political philosophy and for the evaluation of capitalism and socialism, that everybody who's sane takes for granted that egalitarianism will prevail on a camping trip, that everybody will try to cooperate so that everybody has, roughly speaking, a similarly fulfilling time to everybody else. And you can have a camping trip where people are saying, well, Jack isn't really doing his share, and so forth. But imagine what it would be like if what constitutes doing your share would be made precise in such a context. It would actually degrade the quality of the interaction, right? I mean, it's the vagueness of the rule in this instance is not only consistent with it being a rule of justice, but is actually welcome, because if it were made, if it could be made, it's good that it can't be made precise, because if it could be, then a natural and spontaneous form of egalitarian interaction would degenerate into something which is too regulated. But in general, the point I want to make here is that we have to distinguish between the rules regulating society and the publicly available rules that regulate society and what justice is. However, J, although the publicity desideratum is, I've tried to satisfy you, absolutely foreign to justice and has nothing to do with justice, it is nevertheless arguable, or at least argued, that it represents a constraint on justice within the meta-theory of justice that Rawls embraces. The meta-theory of justice means not the theory that tells you what justice is, but the theory that tells you how to find out what justice is. That meta-theory is called Constructivism. And I'll say what Constructivism is in a moment. And it's because Constructivism leads to this identification, it's because Constructivism justifies the publicity constraint, that I have come to question constructivism, because as I tried to indicate about 10 minutes ago, if the publicity constraint is a valid constraint, then my original critique of Rawls's use of the difference principle to justify inequality bites the dust. So let me just say what constructivism is. Many of you will already know this. But I understand constructivism with respect to justice, which is the only constructivism I'm concerned with here, as the view that principles of justice are the outcome of a certain form of selection procedure. In Rawls's case, the selection procedure is the so-called original position that some of you will know about, where people are ignorant of their own situation in society and they're of their own talents and capacities and powers, and they're required to choose principles for the regulation of society under that condition of ignorance, which is supposed to ensure that the principles that they choose have an impartial character. Because nobody can choose principles that are designed to benefit himself or herself, because nobody knows what their own situation is, and therefore what will benefit them. Now, there have been many criticisms of this constructivist procedure, of whether the principles that it produces really are the optimal principles for regulating society. But that isn't my objection at all. My objection is that if you want to know what justice is, you're asking the wrong question. You're putting the wrong question to these choosers, because the question that that is put to them is, what principles for regulating society are the ones that you would like to choose? And it seems to me that that could never be the same as the question, what is justice? For the incredibly simple reason that it's false that justice is the only thing that we should take into account when we decide what the basic principles regulating society are to be. We may well want to take publicity into account in that exercise, even though publicity has nothing to do with justice. To give another example, these choosers of principles must observe a meta-principle of stability, which Rawls emphasizes. That is, when they're deciding what the basic rules governing society are going to be, they have to have regard to the desideratum that these rules are going to be ones that people live by and that are going to last. There's no point setting up society under certain rules if a week later those rules aren't going to prevail. But the idea that justice by its nature is stable is preposterous. I mean, justice might be a very fragile achievement. It seems to me to make perfect sense to speculate that it's very hard to have justice in a stable and reliable way, that however hard you try, as Plato said, there's a danger that things are going to degenerate, things will go wrong. You need lucky contingencies for justice to prevail. None of this can be accepted by a constructivist, because the constructivist choosers have to have regard to the stability of the principles they choose, otherwise they're designing something that isn't going to work. And so the identification by constructivists of the optimal principles for regulating society with justice is a mistake, because the optimal principles for regulating society have to respect constraints that justice doesn't respect. And that is the essence of my criticism of constructivism. As I say here, I have a single objection to it, which is stated in the last sentence of the handout for today's lecture. That is, the single objection is the identification of justice with the general rules for regulating society. And there are 4 sub-objections, 3 of which will be presented in the following lectures. The first of which I'll be talking about tomorrow, is this. It is that facts of human nature and facts about how society is organized, about how you can organize society and general sociological constraints, undoubtedly bear on what are the right principles to choose for organizing society. But I'm going to argue tomorrow that such facts, indeed any facts, have nothing to do with justice. That justice is independent. I know that most of you will think this is insane, but I don't actually agree. That justice is independent of any... The fundamental principles of justice are independent of any views that you might have about what human beings are like and about what society is like. Notice I say the fundamental principles of justice, not all principles of justice. I think that what we normally think of as principles of justice are applied in the light of our knowledge of what human beings are like and of social constraints. And the other two considerations which induce a deviation between what the right principles are for governing society and justice are the considerations of publicity and stability, which I spent a moment or two characterizing earlier. So in tomorrow's lecture, I'm going to argue, I'm going to put justice in the background for the major part of the lecture and return to it at the end of the lecture, because the major part of the lecture will be devoted to trying to satisfy you that our fundamental principles, be they of justice or of anything else, of welfare, of freedom, the fundamental principles that we affirm, where principles are statements that we believe about what we ought to do, are completely insensitive to our beliefs about facts. And I'll state the principal thesis of tomorrow's lecture now, and then return to it when I begin the lecture tomorrow. And that thesis is that whenever a fact is cited to support a principle, and of course facts are constantly cited in support of principles, but for example, the fact that people won't be able to plan their lives in a sensible and productive way if people who make promises to them break those promises, that's a fact, is cited in favor of the principle that one ought to keep one's promises. That's or the fact that religion plays a large role in the lives of some people is a fact cited in support of the principle that there should be religious freedom. And I don't deny that these facts support those principles. Of course, facts support principles, but my thesis is that whenever a fact supports a principle, it always does so only because there's a more ultimate principle in virtue of which that fact supports that principle. Or to put it in the form that I find most appropriate, principles that reflect facts only because they also reflect principles that don't reflect facts. And that's it for today. Thank you very much.